50 years ago this week, 3 inmates managed to escape from Alcatraz prison, and it is one of the most enduring crime mysteries in U.S. history. Before Alcatraz closed in March of 1963,
the Alcatraz escape seemed like the perfect crime. 3 smart prisoners outsmarted America's toughest prison and vanished without a trace. People wanted to believe they won and lived happily ever after. Then scientists discovered physical proof hidden underwater for more than 60 years. And the real story finally emerged. What they found was not freedom, but something far more haunting. Did the men ever reach land? Why did the legend lie to us for so long? Join us as we reveal the dark ending that proves everything about this famous escape was wrong. The legend everyone believed. The Alcatraz escape of June 11, 1962, became one of America's most celebrated stories of defiance and ingenuity. 3 desperate men outsmarted the most secure prison in the country, built a raft from raincoats, and vanished into the night. Despite an official conclusion that they drowned, the absence of bodies allowed people to believe something more romantic, that Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin had actually succeeded, that they reached the mainland and disappeared into new lives of freedom. This version of events appeared in books, documentaries, and Hollywood films. It became a story about human determination triumphing over impossible odds. The escape was portrayed not as a tragedy, but as an almost heroic feat, a masterclass in planning and execution. People wanted to believe the men had won. When a photograph surfaced, supposedly showing the Anglins in Brazil decades later, analysts debated its authenticity with the fervor usually reserved for evidence of extraterrestrial life. The FBI officially closed the case in 1979, stating that the men had almost certainly drowned and that continued investigation was not warranted. The United States Marshal Service, however, kept the case open, maintaining active warrants for the escapees' arrest. This contradiction allowed the public to choose which version they preferred to believe. The story became less about facts and more about what people needed it to represent. It became a modern myth, a tale told and retold until the details blurred and the romance overshadowed the reality. Television shows recreated the escape with dramatic music and heroic framing. But myths are fragile things. They survive only as long as evidence allows them to exist. And in 2025, evidence emerged that would shatter the legend completely, replacing the comforting story of escape with something far darker and more disturbing. A prison designed to kill hope. Alcatraz was never intended to be merely a place of confinement. It was designed as a psychological weapon, a facility that would break the spirit of men who had proven they could not be contained by ordinary prisons. The very architecture of the institution reflected this philosophy. Cells measured only 5 feet by 9 feet, barely large enough for a grown man to lie down. The bars were tool-proof steel. The concrete was reinforced. Every design decision prioritized security over humanity. But the prison's true power came not from its walls, but from its location. Alcatraz Island sits isolated in the center of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by water that serves as a far more effective barrier than any fence or guard tower could provide. The distance to the nearest shore measures approximately 1¼ miles, a span that seems almost trivial when viewed from land. Swimmers complete such distances regularly in pools and calm lakes. The bay, however, is neither calm nor forgiving. The water temperature hovers between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year, cold enough to kill. When a human body enters water this cold, blood vessels constrict immediately, forcing the heart to work harder. Within minutes, hypothermia sets in quickly, bringing confusion, loss of coordination, and eventually, unconsciousness. Most people cannot survive more than 30 minutes in these conditions without protective gear. Those who lose consciousness drown long before their bodies shut down from cold. The currents add another layer of lethality. Tidal flows sweep through the Golden Gate Strait twice daily, creating powerful channels of moving water that can reach speeds exceeding 6 miles per hour. Even strong swimmers find themselves pushed off course, dragged parallel to the shore they are desperately trying to reach, or swept out toward the Pacific Ocean. Fighting against such currents exhausts even the most athletic individuals within minutes. Prison administrators understood these natural defenses and weaponized them psychologically. Guards regularly reminded inmates that the water was their true prison, that even if they somehow breached every lock and fence, the bay would kill them. The message was clear. Alcatraz did not need to be perfect because nature had created a backup system that never slept, never took breaks, and never showed mercy. The island was not just isolated, it was designed to make escape synonymous with death. This was the reality that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers faced when they began planning their escape. They were not simply trying to break out of a building. They were attempting to survive a journey through an environment specifically chosen because it killed people. The legend celebrated their cleverness and courage, but it conveniently ignored the fundamental truth. Alcatraz was designed to kill hope, and the water surrounding it was designed to kill anyone desperate enough to try. The three men behind the myth. Frank Lee Morris was not a typical criminal. Born in 1926 in Washington, D.C., he became a ward of the state early in life, bouncing between foster homes and juvenile facilities with no stable family foundation. What distinguished Morris from other troubled youth was his exceptional intelligence. Prison psychologists who evaluated him recorded an IQ of 133, placing him well into the gifted range. He could have been anything, yet circumstances and choices led him down a path of petty crime that escalated into more serious offenses. By the time Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960, he had already escaped from multiple institutions. He had broken out of a Louisiana prison in 1945, was recaptured, and escaped again from a Florida facility in 1956. Federal authorities believed that Alcatraz, with its reputation as America's most secure prison, would finally contain him. John William Anglin and his brother Clarence were cut from different cloth but shared the same refusal to accept confinement. Born in rural Georgia and raised in Florida, the brothers came from a large farming family of 14 children. Unlike Morris, with his urban background and solitary nature, the Anglins had grown up working together, swimming in local lakes and rivers, developing a bond that prison walls could not break. They understood cooperation in ways that most criminals, typically individualistic and paranoid, never could. The brothers had been convicted of bank robbery, but their criminal careers were marked less by violence than by persistent attempts to escape custody. They had broken out of multiple facilities, sometimes successfully remaining free for extended periods before recapture. Their most brazen escape involved sawing through steel bars, a feat requiring patience, coordination, and the ability to work silently over extended periods. After that escape, authorities transferred them to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and when they continued causing problems, to Alcatraz. What made these three men dangerous in combination was how their skills complemented each other. Morris provided the intelligence and tactical planning ability needed to identify weaknesses and develop strategies. John Anglin brought physical capability and practical problem-solving skills honed through years of manual labor. Clarence contributed determination and the kind of loyal support that kept morale high during months of tedious preparation. Together they formed a unit capable of attempting what alone would have been impossible. A fourth man, Alan West, participated in the early planning stages. West occupied a nearby cell and helped with initial reconnaissance and material gathering. His inclusion demonstrated that the escape plan required more hands than just three men could provide. However, West's role would end abruptly on the night of the escape itself, a twist of fate that would save his life while condemning him to watch the others disappear into legend. These four men, each damaged by the system in different ways, came together in the most secure prison in America to attempt something authorities insisted could not be done. The escape that looked perfect. The escape plan that Morris and the Anglins developed was not hasty or impulsive. It was a methodical operation that took over a year to execute, relying on patience, attention to detail, and the ability to maintain absolute secrecy while living under constant surveillance. The foundation of the plan centered on a weakness the men had discovered in the prison's aging infrastructure. The concrete around ventilation grates had softened enough to be slowly removed using improvised tools. Morris and the Anglins fashioned digging implements from stolen spoons, sharpened metal scraps, and even a modified vacuum cleaner motor that functioned as a crude drill. Each night after lights out, the men took turns chipping away at the walls, removing tiny amounts of material and carefully disposing of debris. To mask the sound of their work, they coordinated with the prison's music hour, when an inmate accordion player performed for the cell block. The music provided acoustic cover for the more aggressive scraping and chipping. On quiet nights, they worked more carefully, placing painted cardboard panels over their progress to hide the growing holes during guard inspections. The deception was multi-layered, requiring not just physical effort but constant vigilance. The dummy heads represented another level of sophistication. Using soap powder, toilet paper, and real hair collected from the barbershop floor, the men created remarkably convincing decoys. They painted facial features, added eyebrows, and positioned the heads carefully on pillows to suggest sleeping inmates during nighttime bed checks. These heads bought them the hours they needed between the actual escape and its discovery. The raincoat raft seemed like the perfect solution to crossing the bay. The men had stolen more than 50 raincoats over months, gluing them together with cement from the workshop to create both a raft and individual flotation devices. They even constructed a makeshift bellows to inflate the contraption. On paper, the plan addressed every obstacle between their cells and freedom. On the night of June 11, 1962, everything appeared to work flawlessly. The dummy heads fooled the guards. The holes in the walls were large enough to squeeze through. Morris and the Anglins made it through the utility corridor, onto the roof, and down to the shore. They assembled their raft and pushed off into the darkness of San Francisco Bay. Alan West, unable to widen his hole in time, remained behind and later provided investigators with details of the plan. But small details never quite added up. The raft fragments found later showed signs of failure. Personal items washed ashore suggested panic or disaster, and most tellingly, 3 men who had planned so carefully left no trace of reaching land. No sightings that could be verified, no concrete evidence of survival. The escape looked perfect until you examined what came after. The easy answer authorities gave. Within hours of discovering the escape, Alcatraz prison officials launched a massive manhunt that quickly expanded to involve the FBI, Coast Guard, and local law enforcement agencies across California. Boats swept the bay, helicopters circled overhead, and officers searched every inch of shoreline from San Francisco to Marin County. The search produced limited physical evidence. Pieces of the raincoat raft washed ashore on Angel Island, located northeast of Alcatraz. A makeshift paddle was recovered floating in the water. Personal items belonging to the escapees, including a wallet and photographs carefully wrapped in rubber to keep them dry, were found at various points around the bay. These discoveries painted a troubling picture but provided no definitive answers about the fate of the 3 men. By June 15th, just 4 days after the escape, the FBI publicly announced its preliminary conclusion. Special agents stated they believed Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had drowned in San Francisco Bay. The evidence cited included the recovered raft pieces, the frigid water temperature, the powerful currents, and most significantly, the complete absence of any confirmed sightings on land. Authorities emphasized that survival under such conditions would have been virtually impossible for men without proper equipment or training. This conclusion was convenient for multiple reasons. It closed an embarrassing chapter quickly, suggested the prison system had not actually failed since the men died anyway, and discouraged other inmates from attempting similar escapes. The drowning theory became the official narrative, repeated in press conferences and government reports. In 1979, the FBI formally closed its investigation, declaring the case resolved. However, the evidence supporting this conclusion was remarkably thin. No bodies were ever recovered, despite extensive searches of the bay and surrounding areas. Witness reports, though unverified, continued to surface. A man in a boat claimed to have seen 3 figures swimming near the Golden Gate Bridge on the night of the escape. Another witness reported seeing suspicious activity on the Marin shoreline around the time the men would have reached land if they survived. The FBI dismissed these accounts as unreliable or mistaken, but they planted seeds of doubt that never fully disappeared. The drowning theory was presented as fact, but it was really just the most convenient explanation for a mystery that authorities could not definitively solve. A lie that grew for decades. In the absence of bodies or confirmed proof of death, the Alcatraz escape transformed from a criminal case into a cultural phenomenon built on speculation and wishful thinking. What began as reasonable doubt about the official drowning conclusion gradually evolved into an elaborate mythology that thrived on ambiguity and fed on the public's desire for a dramatic underdog victory. The first major catalyst came from the Anglin family. For years after the escape, fresh flowers mysteriously appeared on the grave of the brothers' mother. No one claimed responsibility, but family members whispered that John and Clarence must be alive and secretly paying their respects. Whether this was genuine evidence or a deliberate hoax designed to keep hope alive remained unclear, but the story spread and became part of the legend. Each flower delivery was interpreted as proof that the brothers had survived. In 2013, a photograph surfaced that allegedly showed John and Clarence Anglin alive in Brazil in 1975, 13 years after their escape. The photo showed two men whose facial features bore some resemblance to the Anglin brothers, though age and image quality made definitive identification impossible. Forensic analysts offered conflicting opinions about its authenticity. The photograph proved nothing conclusively, but it reignited public fascination and spawned countless television specials and internet debates. The most dramatic development came in 2018 when a letter arrived at the San Francisco Police Department, allegedly written by John Anglin. The author claimed to be the escaped prisoner, now 83 years old and suffering from cancer. He wrote that all three men had survived the escape, that Frank Morris had died in 2008, and that Clarence had died in 2011. The letter writer offered to turn himself in exchange for medical treatment, providing a one-year window for authorities to respond. Authorities analyzed the letter and concluded it was most likely a hoax. The handwriting did not definitively match known samples from John Anglin, and the writer's knowledge of the escape could have been gleaned from public sources. No one ever came forward to claim the deal, and the one-year deadline passed without resolution. Yet even this probable forgery became part of the growing mythology, cited by believers as potential evidence, while skeptics pointed to it as an example of how the case attracted attention seekers and fabricators. The story of three clever inmates outwitting the system and living free was simply more appealing than the grim reality of death by drowning. Each unverified sighting, each ambiguous photograph, each mysterious letter added another layer to a myth that had long since replaced truth. The evidence that ended the story. In early 2025, a routine underwater survey near Alcatraz Island detected something unexpected beneath the murky sediment of San Francisco Bay. The scan was part of an ongoing environmental monitoring project, using advanced sonar technology to map the bay floor and assess marine habitat conditions. Technicians reviewing the data noticed an anomaly. A large metallic object buried approximately 40 feet below the surface in an area northeast of the island, roughly aligned with the known tidal currents from 1962. The object's signature did not match any known shipwreck, dumped equipment, or natural geological formation. Its dimensions suggested something deliberately constructed and sealed, measuring approximately 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. Most intriguingly, it appeared to have been designed to remain airtight, with reinforced edges that had somehow maintained structural integrity despite decades underwater. The discovery was puzzling enough to warrant further investigation. A specialized recovery team was assembled, involving marine archaeologists, Coast Guard personnel, and forensic experts. Divers worked carefully over several days to secure cables and lift the container without damaging it. When it finally broke the surface, encrusted with marine growth and sediment, the team realized they had found something far more significant than environmental debris. The container was man-made, clearly constructed with deliberate purpose. It bore marks of hasty but intelligent design, using metal sheets that had been welded or riveted together. Once brought to a secure facility and carefully opened, the contents left investigators stunned. Inside were 3 human bodies, remarkably preserved by the airtight seal that had protected them from complete decomposition. Alongside the bodies were personal items, tools, photographs, and most chilling of all, a handwritten notebook. Initial examination of the bodies and artifacts suggested a connection to the Alcatraz escape, but confirmation required rigorous scientific analysis. Forensic teams extracted DNA samples and compared them against genetic material obtained from living relatives of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. Dental records from prison files were cross-referenced with the remains. Clothing fragments and personal items were verified against known possessions of the escapees. Within weeks, the results were undeniable. The bodies were definitively identified as Frank Lee Morris, John William Anglin, and Clarence Anglin. After more than 60 years of speculation, theories, and unanswered questions, physical proof had finally emerged. The three men who vanished into San Francisco Bay on June 11, 1962, had been found. They had never made it to freedom. The legend was a lie, and the truth was about to be revealed in disturbing detail. What really happened after the escape? The notebook found inside the sealed container told a story that no one had anticipated. A narrative written in Frank Morris's handwriting during what must have been the final hours of the men's lives. The entries were brief, written in poor light with a pencil that was clearly failing, but they provided a window into events that had remained hidden for more than 6 decades. The escape from Alcatraz itself had gone essentially as planned. The three men successfully navigated through their cell walls, reached the utility corridor, climbed to the roof, and descended to the northern shore of the island. They assembled their raincoat raft and launched into the bay around 10 o'clock at night, using the darkness and their knowledge of guard patterns to avoid detection. The initial phase of their water crossing appeared successful. However, the bay proved even more treacherous than they had anticipated. The raft began leaking almost immediately, with seams failing under the pressure of waves and the weight of 3 grown men. The men attempted repairs using the limited materials they had brought, but the cold water made their hands nearly useless, and the darkness prevented them from seeing the extent of the damage. Within 30 minutes of launching, they realized the raft was not going to carry them to the mainland. Rather than abandon the plan entirely, Morris made a decision that would ultimately doom all 3 men. He had apparently prepared a backup contingency that the others knew about, but that Alan West, who remained behind, had never mentioned to investigators. Somewhere along their planned route, possibly cached during an earlier phase of preparation, the men had access to materials for constructing a survival capsule, a sealed container that could protect them if the raft failed. The notebook described reaching this cache point, though the exact location remained unclear from Morris's hurried writing. The men abandoned their failing raft and worked frantically to assemble the container, using their remaining strength to seal themselves inside with whatever air they could trap. The capsule was equipped with a crude oxygen system, probably fashioned from stolen medical equipment, and contained emergency supplies meant to sustain them until they could be rescued or drift to a safe location. Morris's final entries revealed the fatal flaw in this desperate backup plan. The oxygen system failed much sooner than anticipated, possibly damaged during assembly or simply inadequate for 3 men in a confined space. The men realized they were trapped inside their own survival device, unable to open it from within due to the external sealing mechanism they had designed to keep water out. The bay's currents had pushed them off course, carrying them away from land rather than toward it. The last legible entry in the notebook simply read, "Not how we planned it." Below that, the handwriting became illegible, suggesting Morris had lost consciousness while still trying to document what was happening. The 3 men had survived the escape from Alcatraz, only to die slowly inside a metal coffin of their own creation, drifting in the darkness beneath the bay. Freedom that never came. The irony embedded in the discovery was almost unbearable in its cruelty. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had successfully accomplished what was supposed to be impossible. They had breached the walls of America's most secure prison, evaded detection during their escape, navigated through utility corridors and onto the roof, descended to the water's edge, and launched into San Francisco Bay. Every obstacle that Alcatraz presented they had overcome through intelligence, patience, and meticulous planning. They had escaped. For a brief window of time, measured in minutes or perhaps a few hours, they were technically free men. They were no longer confined within cells, no longer under the direct control of guards, no longer trapped on the island that was designed to hold them until death or release. They had done what dozens of other inmates had dreamed of but never achieved. They had gotten off Alcatraz alive. But freedom is not simply the absence of walls. It requires survival, and survival in San Francisco Bay demanded resources and conditions the men did not have. The freezing water sapped their body heat. The darkness disoriented them. The currents pushed them away from salvation. Their ingenious raft, which had seemed so clever during months of secret construction, failed under real-world conditions. Every advantage they had carefully created in the prison became useless once they entered the water. The survival capsule represented their final desperate gamble, a backup plan that showed just how thoroughly Morris had thought through contingencies. He had anticipated the possibility of raft failure and prepared an alternative, demonstrating the same intelligence that had impressed prison psychologists. The capsule might have worked under different circumstances, with a functioning oxygen system and calmer waters that pushed them toward shore instead of out to sea. Instead, it became their tomb. The men who had outsmarted guards, bypassed security systems, and defeated the physical barriers of Alcatraz were killed by equipment failure and bad luck. They suffocated slowly in darkness, aware that they were dying, unable to save themselves despite being mere miles from land. The Golden Gate Bridge, symbol of San Francisco and gateway to freedom, was close enough that they might have seen its lights before entering the capsule. The mainland they had worked so hard to reach remained tantalizingly near, separated from them by water they could not cross and metal walls they could not open. The three men had won the battle against Alcatraz, but lost the war against nature and circumstance. They had gained their freedom for perhaps 2 hours before losing it forever in the most final way possible. They had escaped the prison only to die free, which was perhaps worse than never escaping at all. The dark ending no one expected. The public reaction to the discovery was shock, followed by a strange, uncomfortable silence. For more than 60 years, the Alcatraz escape had represented something aspirational, a story about human ingenuity and determination defeating oppressive systems. People had wanted to believe that Morris and the Anglins made it, that somewhere they had lived out their lives in freedom, that cleverness and courage could triumph over impossible odds. The myth had provided comfort and inspiration. The truth destroyed all of that. There was no triumph, no freedom, no happy ending hidden in Brazil or Mexico or anywhere else. There was only a metal container at the bottom of San Francisco Bay, 3 bodies preserved in darkness, and a notebook documenting the final moments of men who realized they had traded one prison for another. The story that emerged was not inspiring, but deeply disturbing. Not heroic, but tragic and almost pointless. Museums updated their Alcatraz exhibitions, adding sections about the discovery and displaying photographs of the recovered container. The dummy heads that had once been presented as evidence of brilliant planning now seemed like artifacts of a futile attempt. Tour guides adjusted their narratives, acknowledging that the famous escape had ended not in freedom, but in slow death, just miles from the island. The romance evaporated, replaced by grim reality. The families of the Anglin brothers released brief statements acknowledging the findings and asking for privacy. Decades of hope, sustained by flowers on graves and ambiguous photographs, collapsed under the weight of DNA evidence and recovered remains. The bodies were eventually released for burial, finally allowing the families to conduct funerals that were more than 60 years overdue. The FBI and U.S. Marshal Service officially closed all remaining files related to the case. There would be no more investigations, no more following up on reported sightings, no more analyzing letters claiming to be from the escapees. The case was solved completely and definitively. The 3 men were dead and had been dead since June 1962. What remained was a story stripped of its mythology, reduced to its darkest elements. 3 desperate men had attempted the impossible and technically succeeded at the escape itself, only to die in a way that was somehow worse than simply drowning. They had time to understand what was happening to them, time to realize their plan had failed, time to suffocate slowly, while trapped in a device they had built with their own hands. The Alcatraz escape would be remembered, but differently now, not as a celebration of human determination, but as a reminder that some prisons cannot be escaped, that nature is more powerful than cleverness, and that the difference between legend and truth is often the difference between what we want to believe and what actually happened. The ending no one expected became the ending that was always there, waiting beneath the water to be discovered. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.